in keeping with my little series of clauses that you should be checking in your contract reviews, today we're talking about the ones you should be watching out for with regard to variations.
Are you an Aussie tradie and your paperwork is shady? Do the dockers from side keep you up late at night? Are you sick of pushing paper, swinging your tools as more you caper? Call us the tricks of your trade.
Welcome to the Tricks of Your Trade podcast, where we talk about trade business topics to help you get through business life unscathed.
Does the builder pay you late and your cash flow fluctuates? Do you dread the office work? Can't afford a full-time clerk? Consider working smarter. Don't be a business martyr. Call us the tricks of your trade.
Hello, welcome to the Tricks of Your Trade podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Serson, construction lawyer, adjudicator, and director of Tricks of Your Trade. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. I actually had somebody give me an inquiry through my website about this the other day, and I did do a podcast, maybe a year ago, about margin on variations. So this is a hot topic, and this is something that we're seeing happen more and more, where material prices are starting to get more competitive with suppliers, and subcontracts that builders signed people up for 6 to 12 months ago, the builders are starting to realize that they can get a little bit better pricing. And so what they're doing is they're going back to the subbies that they've already signed up, and they're directing a negative variation under the contract for the remaining scope and getting somebody cheaper to come in and do the job. So this is why it's so important for you to be able to make sure that you're protected if that happens to you. Now, a really good example of this, we had a tiler who had a project where there was a lot of mosaic tile to go into wet areas into a really fancy building, and the tiles were really boring, easy to lay tiles. The wall tiles were mosaic, but in the wet areas, the floor tiles were mosaic as well. The builder had asked the subcontractor to standardise his floor tile rate at tender and just give a single rate for all the floor tiles. One would wonder whether the builder knew what they were setting this guy up for. But what effectively happened was the subcontractor had done all of the difficult work, and then the builder came in and deleted all of the easy work from his contract as a negative variation. Now, that work got deleted at a leaner rate for a standardized floor tile. But even worse than that, under the contract, there was a provision that said where a negative variation is to be valued, it's to be valued for the rate for that tile. Plus, they had to deduct a percentage for margin. So the subcontractor had to give back margin that he didn't actually allocate to on that particular line item in his tender, because he had standardized the floor rates and he had more money in the mosaic. So it was a real problem. Effectively, the subcontractor would have gone and done a heap of really easy work with these floor tiles, and that's where he was going to make his money. Builder deleted it, went and got somebody cheaper. So today I want to talk to you about variations and what the pitfalls are, and the clauses you need to chase down and get changed in your contract. So the first thing you need to think about is, for how long can my builder direct me to do a variation? And you would be surprised to find that most builders' contracts say they can direct you until the end of the defects liability period. Some contracts even say at any time. So if you think about it, if you've got a 12-month defects liability period and you know the job's going to run for a year and a half, do you really want to be hanging around for possibly 3 years for the builder to be able to give you a variation at the rates that you have agreed to today? So it's incredibly important to make sure the first thing you look for, and it will be in the variation clause that says the builder may direct the subcontractor to vary the works. You need to have a look to see how long for. How long does the clause say the builder can direct you for? I like to change it to say up until practical completion. I think that's fair and reasonable. The builder is going to want to be able to use you for variations up until PC, but really, past the defects liability period or past practical completion, you should have the right to decline a variation, because otherwise you will not have the right to decline a variation. And so that's my next one on the list, is you need to work out if you have any right to say no to a variation. Some contracts will say that the variation has to be in keeping with the general nature intent of the work that you were already doing under the contract, but a lot of builders' contracts won't say anything. So you need to be able to say, hey, I'm not doing that variation, or I'm not properly licensed for that variation, but I can only be directed to do variations generally in keeping with the nature and intent of the scope that I was already contracted to do. So bear that in mind. Now, margin on variations, here's where you find that. Now, in every builder's contract, where they talk about variations, they will have a clause that says valuation of variations or valuation. You need to read that clause and work out how the builder will value your variations, because in a lot of instances, it will say the builder can direct you to do a variation as day work. And if you have a look at the valuation method for day work, it will be your payroll costs plus the margin in the schedule. And when you go to the schedule, it'll say 5%. So can you imagine if you had somebody's payroll hourly rate and you were setting them to site to do work and you could only charge 5% on what you're paying them? So quickly every subcontractor would go broke like that. Normally the charge out rate for labor is 3 or 4 times the salary amount, because there are other costs associated with doing that kind of work. For example, training and onboarding costs. They might have vehicles, they might have to do inductions. They probably have telephones, all those types of things, work cover, other insurances. So the overheads for your variations are incredibly important to be captured. Now, that's the other thing we need to talk about is when you go to your valuation clause, the first thing you want to look at is, does it say the builder can value the variation in accordance with the following order of precedence? Or does it just say in the builder's absolute discretion, they can pick something off this list? You want it to say in the following order of precedence, because you want to have some control over the order in which the builder can choose to value your work. The first one should always be by agreement. If the parties agree, then by agreement. The second one's usually any rates or prices stated in the contract. So that's where you put your schedule of rates in and make sure that that's in the contract, so that you can go, okay, well, if we can't agree on a price for this, then at least it has to be based on the second order of precedence, which would be the schedule of rates in the contract. Now, the third one will always be reasonable rates with a reasonable margin. And the fourth one is usually by day works. Now, unless you normally do things by day works, I have just been crossing out the day works clauses because it's so risky. I would much rather you put a schedule of rates in your contract for your trade that's specific to your trade than rely on some vague day works clause that says that you basically get to on cost your employees like labour hire with a percentage margin on your cost. That is just not viable for anyone. It's an incredibly high risk thing to do. Now, about that percentage margin on variations will almost always say that it includes attendance, supervision, preliminaries, on and off-site overheads. Now, if you have 5% in your schedule to be paid for variations, and that has to include your overheads, that's a loss. You're actually paying the builder to do variations. And I've spoken to multiple accountants about this, and they consistently tell me that the average overhead for a small trade business turning over anywhere between 5 and 15 million a year is going to be about 26% in terms of overheads. So if the builder is saying they're going to pay you 5%, that includes margin and overheads, you are subsidizing their work heavily. In fact, probably close to within the vicinity of 20% for that work. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that the overheads portion is split up from the profit portion. So what I like to write is 10% profit, 12.5% overheads. Now, guys, that's still half of what most average trade businesses actually have incurred the cost of with their businesses, with overheads. Overheads is an incredibly difficult thing to get a builder to agree to. And it's an incredibly difficult thing for you to be able to prove. So say, for example, you have an insurance policy that costs you $100,000 a year. How do you prove how many projects that is spread across for any given variation. It's incredibly difficult. You can see where I'm going with it. So what I usually like to do is say to the builder, we need to have a clear profit. It needs to be clean, clear profit. And industry standard is actually 10%. It's just that builders over time have whittled it down to 5%. If you were a resi builder, all of the standard industry contracts would say you would get 20% margin. So 5% is so close to the wire, it's just not funny. In terms of overheads, 12.5% needs to be separate and distinct, because if the builder ever tries to deduct a variation or have a negative variation under your contract and they say that they should be entitled to profit but not overheads, you want the smaller percentage to be deducted with that credit than the overheads amount. So your overheads are an actual cost to your business, your profit's your profit, and making sure that you have those percentages right in the schedule is key. If you need help with this, reach out, because it's not an easy thing to chase down. But I just want to draw your attention to it. If you go looking in your contract to work out what margin you're going to get paid on a variation and a negative variation, and you can't work it out, please get in touch with somebody. It doesn't have to be us. Get in touch with somebody who can help you work out what the answer to that question is before you sign that contract. Now, when it comes to negative variations, this is where lawyers will be very clever and try and hide this part from you. This is what I was talking about earlier about the tiler who had the floor tiles removed from his contract, and the builder said, we want the margin credit on that as well. You need to go chasing down the negative variation provisions in your contract, work out how they're going to be valued, and mark them up so that they say that if there is a negative variation, that you're not giving back any margin. And the way that I justify this to the builder is I say to them, listen, guys, you asked me to price this competitively in tender. And the only way I can price it competitively is if I spread the margin across the whole job. In other words, I'm relying on the volume of this work to go in at a competitive margin to win this job. So if you want to take work out of my scope, I can't do what's left for that skinny margin. That skinny margin is only viable based on the volume of work that you're giving me. Most of the time, builders will understand that. And in terms of pushback, where they say, well, we have to give it back under the head contract, what I would say to them is, look, in most instances, what you have to pay me is actually passed up the chain in your, whether it be a credit or whether it be in addition to the contract. So my costs should not have a bearing on whether or not you have to give back margin. You're giving back your own margin. Now, there's one last thing that we've seen crop up in builders' contracts, and it's been around for a few years, but it's really starting to bother me because builders are effectively saying to subcontractors, we found a defect, but we don't want you to fix it. We're just going to revalue the work you did for us based on this being defective. So this work is actually worth less to us because you didn't use what we expected. Now, the best example I can give for you with this is if you were a plumber and you were required to put in copper pipe into the building. And instead of putting in copper pipe, you put in PEX pipe. Now, PEX pipe may well be just as suitable in terms of the building codes. There's no compliance issue whatsoever. But the builder says, hey, that costs you a lot less. It's actually worth less to us because you didn't put in copper, you put in plastic. I want to have the difference in the value of the work that you carried out for me. And they will direct a negative variation for that. Now, in the instance that I gave you where I was talking about it being for a plumber and it had no bearing on the building code because everything was compliant both ways, what I would like to point out is that if you are the type of trade where the defect that they're accusing you of having is a compliance issue, you need to be able to go back and rectify it. You can't just let that sitting there and being a problem into the future. They should give you a reasonable opportunity to go back and rectify that. So I always like to cross out that clause and say, no, if you come across a defect, we stand by our work. We want the opportunity to go back and fix it, and we won't be giving you a credit for it. We will, at our own cost, go and fix our own defect if it is in fact a defect. So those are the 5 things 5 things for variation clauses. So I'll quickly just go back through so that you can remember, so it's off the top of your head if you're writing notes. How long can they direct you to do a variation for? When does it end? Is it at practical completion? Is it at end of defects liability period? Is it forever that they can direct you to do a variation? You need to put a lid on that. Whether you have the right to decline a variation, and you should be able to decline a variation that is outside of your ordinary scope of work. Margin on variations and the margin on the credits. Do you have to give back margin with your credit? You need to know the answer to that before you sign your contract. Variations accepted for defects, and then they just value it down and deduct it from you, but they don't want you to actually go back and rectify. So those are the 5 things that I'd really love for you to find in your variation clauses in your contract. As I mentioned in our last episode, I have got a comprehensive checklist on my website that is $97 including GST for your contract reviews. So if you would like to know everything that I check in the builder's contract, and it's not helpful with me just blurting it out orally onto a podcast, and you're trying to frantically take notes, it would be really clever if you just went to my website, www.tricksofyourtrade.com.au, and download the checklist, and then you will have it for you as well. I am going to do another episode about termination clauses, but it won't be today, and it may take a little while for me to get that one back up because there is a little bit of a backlog in my timetable because of recent matters that we've had going on. For those of you who've been listening to my show for a little while, I did have probably an 8 or 9 month break in my podcast. And if you're wondering why, it's because I started a law firm. I went out and started a bricks and mortar law firm called Subcontractor Legal. So I have a really good excuse for not podcasting. I really love doing these podcasts, and I do plan to do a weekly podcast moving forward. So thank you to all those people who stuck by me and were sending me messages saying, hey, when are you going to drop the next podcast? Because it really meant a lot. It's nice to know that people are actually getting the benefit of these podcasts. All right, be in touch soon. If you have any questions about what I've talked about on this podcast, feel free to drop me a good old-fashioned email at questions@tricksofyourtrade.com.au. If you would like a systematic approach to your contract administration and getting paid, head on over to our website and check out the Subbies Toolbox. You won't be disappointed there. And just one last time, our web address is www.tricksofyourtrade.com.au.
Are you an Aussie tradie and your paperwork is shady? Do the dockers farm side keep you up late at night? Are you sick of pushing paper, swinging your tools more you caper? Call us the Tricks of Your Trade.
Welcome to the Tricks of Your Trade podcast, where we talk about trade business topics to help you get through business life unscathed.
Does the builder pay you late and your cash flow fluctuates? Do you dread the office work? Can't afford a full-time clerk? Consider working smarter. Don't be a business martyr. Call us the Tricks of Your Trade.